the topic for today, obviously, we want to try and connect a little bit about what's going on in the world, especially and specifically what's going on in Israel, between Israel and Gaza, and because we care about that, and it's on our mind. I know many people are telling me that it's hard to take their eyes off of the live blogs that are on all the news websites, and I know it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. We all want to know what's happening. When will this be over? And there's a lot of ideas and a lot of philosophies and theologies that are flying all over the place. So it's worth it to give a little talk about understanding religion vis-a-vis putting yourself at risk. And the reason why I chose this topic is firstly because we have this information that the civilian residents of Gaza are voluntarily, or well, I don't know. It could be voluntarily, it could be that they're forced to do it, putting themselves specifically, intentionally, in harm's way. Now, whether it's voluntarily or that they're actually forced, that's obviously two different things, but nonetheless, they're putting themselves in harm's way, presumably for what they believe in. And then the FAA here in the United States banned flights to Israel, all U.S. carriers to Israel, again, presumably because there was a significant security or safety threat. And the hero of the week that week was our former mayor, Mike Bloomberg, who on purpose took a flight to Israel putting himself at risk. Well, again, that's what we're going to have to define. Putting himself at risk to prove that people were not at risk. So the question arises, when are you allowed to put yourself at risk? If it's for what you believe in, does that mean it's across the board? Does it mean you can always volunteer to put your life in danger for any purpose or for any cause or for any belief? And what does Judaism have to say about that? Obviously, there's an institutionalized putting yourself at risk. It's called being in the military. That's a governmental institution of putting oneself at risk. So we know that the Torah itself has a draft, right? It says in the Torah, according to Torah law, there's a certain age range that men have to go into the tzava, as it says in the Torah. They have to go into the army. They have to become part of a military force between certain ages. It's written in the Torah.
Is that only during a time of war, or that was an army all the time?
Good question. It's a good question. It seems from the way the Torah is written that all the time those people are, it seems that they're in the reserves. That's what it seems like.
Okay.
Meaning there's no full-time military.
Right.
But that in the event of either an offensive or defensive, between those ages, they must join the army. So we have this institution called the military, which forces people to put themselves at risk. And the truth of the matter is that this concept only finds itself valid, and in fact, almost all of the discussion about putting oneself at risk in the traditional Jewish sources has to do with saving others. There's a verse in the Torah, a verse in the Torah. It says, "Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa." You cannot stand by while your brother's blood is being spilled. You can't stand by. What does that mean? You can't stand by. It means that, according to the Talmud, if your fellow man is in imminent threat of danger, you must do what you can to save him. And it seems that you must do, meaning you must even put yourself into danger to save that person. That's what it seems to say. Right? So it's written in Jewish law, and it says that specifically, someone who sees a fellow man drowning or robbers coming after him, and he has the ability to save him himself, or he has the ability to get others to save him, and he doesn't save that person, he has transgressed this verse of the Torah that says, "Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa." Do not stand by while your brother's blood is being spilled. So if you have the opportunity to save someone from harm, you have the responsibility to save someone from harm. So the question is, it sounds as if we have a mandate to go to whatever degree necessary to save another person from imminent danger. But we also have a concept in the Torah that says, Chayecha kodmim, your life comes first. And we all might know this famous discussion in the Talmud. The two men walking in the desert, and they only have a canteen of water that's enough for one of them. The first commentary on this story says they should both drink and both die, so that they're not put in the position of choosing one life over the other. That's the first conclusion. And that conclusion is overruled. The conclusion is overruled by the famous Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, whoever has the water has an obligation to drink it himself to keep himself alive and not cause the death of both of them. Why? Concludes the Talmud, because chayecha kodmim, your life comes first. You have a right and a responsibility to guard yourself from harm. Yeah.
What if you're married?
What do you mean, what if you're married?
Do you have to, don't you have to take care of your spouse?
Well, your child would probably be...
You mean the through thick and thin for good times and bad times?
No,
through drought and regular water times.
Like the ketubah. So you have to, we have to do so. Like, don't you have to,
You're saying that the ketubah specifically enumerates the responsibilities that a husband has for his wife. And you're right. It doesn't say has to give up his life.
I'm not saying that. I'm just thinking, you're saying this water's mine and not yours. It just seems to be in conflict.
Listen, this whole conversation is about internal conflict. Right? It really is, because our feelings may get in the way of what the Torah teaches. And it could be, depending on whose life is in danger, we may be even stricter than what the law demands, even if in general practice we're not stricter than what the law demands, but it's because of the way we feel about that person. Nonetheless, we have to have a standard of behavior. So we have these two conflicting concepts within Jewish law. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, you cannot stand by while someone is in imminent danger, seemingly that you must do whatever you can to stop that imminent danger. And on the other hand, you have a responsibility to make sure that you yourself are not put in danger. So how do we understand these ideas? Obviously, we know that Judaism teaches that the preservation of life is of the utmost importance. In fact, Judaism teaches that all the commandments of the Torah are considered null and void in the face of a life danger, except for 3. All commandments in the Torah are considered what we call in Hebrew, ya'avor va'al yehareg. You must transgress them and not die. Except for 3, being murder, sexual immorality as enumerated by the Torah itself, those the specific things that the Torah says as sexually deviant, and 3, idolatry, or the practices associated with idolatry. So those 3 things, says the Talmud, the halacha, the law is yehareg va'al ya'avor. You must die and not transgress those 3 things. Meaning, if somebody were to have a gun at your head and say, I want you to do some act of immorality that the Torah says is forbidden, or I'm going to kill you, the person would have to submit to death. If a person said to you, on the pain of death, either kill this innocent person here, or you will die, Jewish law says that you have to submit to death. Because you're not allowed to kill someone to save your own life. You're not allowed to kill an innocent person to save your own life. Yes?
So this is why I don't understand Pinchas, because he killed the people who were acting deviantly, but he didn't commit murder.
That's the reason. That's the reason. Pinchas, it's a good question, but it's an extreme exception. An extreme exception to the rule, and it seems to be concluded by the Talmud and all of our commentaries that action was for Pinchas alone and never again for anyone else. It's a good question, but it's very, very an extreme example that it's not applicable. There's no application, no practical application. So again, so we believe that you have a responsibility to transgress any sin or to do any act in order to save your own life. And so we, obviously in Judaism, it's very important that the preservation of life, we believe, takes precedent over every other commandment. Except for 3. Actually, there are 2 more exceptions to the rule as well. The other thing that the commentaries, the Talmud explain, that you have to give up your life for, or you have to put your life at risk for, is if there is a public desecration of God. So, for example, there are those 3 prohibitions of murder, idolatry, and sexual immorality are what we call the 3 cardinal sins. You have to die rather than transgress them. But the Talmud says that all of the commandments of the Torah you have to die for rather than transgress them, if by doing the transgression, it will come to be a public desecration of God. So if a person is being forced in a public forum on the pain of death, let's say a person is being forced to eat pork, which according to the Torah is forbidden to eat by a Jewish person. If a person is forced under pain of death in his private home to eat a ham sandwich, the Torah would say, eat the ham sandwich. You should transgress that law of the Torah and not die. But if a person is being broadcast on HBO on the pain of death to eat the ham sandwich in public and say publicly that there is no God, or the laws of the Torah are ridiculous, or whatever it might be, a public desecration of God in such a way, then to eat the ham sandwich would be forbidden, and he would have to submit to death. That's the fourth exception to the rule of you have to preserve life. And there is a fifth exception. A fifth exception. The fifth exception is when Judaism is at risk. Then it becomes an imperative to live your life as a Jew no matter what. So there's a famous story in the Talmud. His name was Elisha. He was called Elisha Baal Kinafayim. Elisha, the man of wings. Why do they call him Elisha, the man of wing, or the master of wings? So the story goes that he lived at the time of the Roman occupation of the land of Israel, and it was forbidden to wear tefillin. There was a law against wearing tefillin on the pain of death. And Elisha, this man Elisha, wore tefillin in public. Why did he wear tefillin in public? Because the mitzvah of tefillin was at risk of being totally nullified. And so he proudly wore tefillin in public, even though it was against the law. Now, generally speaking, the reason why, for all the commandments that you would have to give up your life for, they're all negative commandments. Positive commandments, you generally don't have to give up your life for because you just don't do them. And there's no desecration of God's name. So if you were to take the HBO presentation again, if somebody were to say, don't put on tefillin, okay, so you wouldn't put on tefillin. Because it's not a prohibition. But both the negative and the positive commandments become connected to you must die rather than forget about them, rather than transgress it, when Judaism as a whole is threatened to cease. So why was he called Elisha Baal Kinafayim? Because he was wearing his tefillin, and a Roman soldier saw him, gave chase. Elisha ran away, and the Roman soldier caught up to him, and as he was catching him, he took the tefillin off, and he held it in his hand. I know it's hard to imagine that because we wear very large tefillin, but in the day when people wore their tefillin all day long, which is the law in Judaism and was the practice at those times, their tefillin was about this big. They had micro writing in their tefillin. Have you ever seen these before? Mm-mm. If you ever go to Israel, if you ever happen to go to the exhibits of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see even 2,000 years ago how they wrote their tefillin on these tiny, tiny little things. And it's really quite amazing to see this micro writing. Anyhow, so their tefillin was like this big. It was like a little peanut size here and here. So Elisha took it off and he clenched his hand. So the Roman soldier said to him, show me what's in your hand. And when he opened his hand, a dove flew out, according to the story. So, whether or not you believe the story, whatever the story is coming to teach us, is that it seems that this person he merited. Now, obviously, we're not going to say that everyone would merit this kind of miracle.
Or magic trick.
But nonetheless, it is coming to teach us that even in the middle of, and specifically in a time when tefillin itself, the mitzvah, the laws of Judaism were at a risk of being forgotten forever because there were laws against performing those commandments, he had a responsibility to wear them, even on the pain of death. Did he die? No, because a miracle happened, or a sleight of hand happened, and he was saved. But the story still goes to teach us that a person has a responsibility to put himself in harm's way for the preservation of Judaism. So it's very interesting because there's a lot of commentary associated with this story and an understanding how and when a person is supposed to put himself at risk. And there is a dispute among our famous medieval commentaries as to whether or not you are allowed to volunteer to put yourself in harm's way. All other things aside, are you allowed to volunteer to put yourself in harm's way, to risk your life? So Maimonides, who is by far the most famous of our legal decisors, he says explicitly that if there is no outside reason to put your life at risk, you are totally and absolutely forbidden. Hi.
I got lost.
It's okay. So Maimonides says it's absolutely forbidden to put yourself at risk in an unwarranted situation. In fact, he concludes legally that if you do put your life at risk in an unwarranted situation and you die, you're guilty of suicide. And another commentary, he's called the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim, who lived around the same time. He comes to the conclusion, based on the story of Elisha, the master of wings, he comes to the conclusion that in a situation where where martyrdom is not obligated, you still have the right to volunteer. So what does this mean for us in a practical sense? Are we allowed to put ourselves into danger? Are we living in a time, might we come to the conclusion that we're living in a time that would warrant putting ourselves at risk? It's interesting. Just to go back to the original example that I explained of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, not standing by while your fellow's blood is being spilled, and whether or not you're allowed to put yourself into danger to save him. It seems that there's only one place in the Talmud that says that you are obligated to put yourself into the possibility of danger in order to save him. That's the Jerusalem Talmud. Generally speaking, we do not come to our legal decisions based on the Jerusalem Talmud. We come to our decisions based on the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud says that you are not allowed to put yourself in risk in the possibility of harm to save somebody else's life. But the Jerusalem Talmud argues. And according to the practical law, there's one of the practical legal deciders. The book is called the Aruch HaShulchan, and he says like this. He says the legal deciders have brought in the name of the Jerusalem Talmud that a person is obligated to put himself into possible danger in order to save his fellow man. But most of our earlier legal deciders did away with it. They didn't even write it down, because the Babylonian Talmud says that you are not obligated to put yourself into the possibility of danger. But his conclusion is like this: Umihu, however, hakol lefi ha'inyan. You should make your decision based on every situation on its own. Every situation is its own situation. We shouldn't decide to either be lenient or strict, however you want to view whatever, I can tell, if you don't put yourself in the possibility of danger, or you do, there are two ways of looking at it, whether it's a lenient or strict view of the law. It's lenient on yourself or strict on others, or the opposite. So, everything according to the situation. Everything according to the situation. So presumably this general principle would apply to all the situations where one would need to or could put himself into life danger, the possibility of life danger. That one could judge for himself based on the situation. Generally speaking, Jewish law teaches that if you are uncertain of whether a situation is a life-threatening situation, you must conclude that it is until it can be proven otherwise. I think as I was reading that in the books, I thought, wow, that's Mayor Bloomberg. He did it for us. I don't know if he was necessarily allowed to do it in the first place.
He proved that it was otherwise.
But he proved that it was otherwise. He proved that it was not dangerous. In fact, that was his stated purpose, to prove that it was not dangerous. And again, everything according to the specific situation. Now, there is a dividing line, and that is the concept of uncertainty. And that's really the most important word in the discussion, the concept of uncertainty. If you don't know, you must conclude that it is dangerous and not do it. But if it can be decided otherwise, that it is not dangerous, then you're allowed to. Now, regarding the difference between what we would call the human shields, wherever it is that the target has been specified is exactly where they go. There is no level of uncertainty. In fact, there's almost absolute certainty that you are forfeiting your life. So, specifically according to Maimonides, to volunteer to put yourself into harm's way, certainly putting yourself in harm's way, without any warrant, would constitute suicide. Meaning, we wouldn't praise such a person. On the other hand, there are still rockets that could possibly fall near the airport or otherwise, and there's no doubt that anyone who is now flying to Israel is thinking about that. So what do you do in that sort of situation? You're fearful. Meaning, even though it's uncertain and it seems to have been proven that it is not dangerous, you still fear that it might happen. And so, for you, your specific situation, you believe that you are putting yourself into danger. So are you allowed to do that? Even if it's proven that it's not dangerous, but you feel as though you're putting yourself into danger, are you allowed to do such a thing? Generally speaking, Judaism teaches that you are allowed to do such a thing because your specific feelings are nullified against the larger whole. We have this concept in Jewish law that a general principle usually overrides an individual's connection or feeling or even belief about a certain situation. But you can imagine that even if, let's just say, for example, if we could imagine that it is dangerous to fly to Israel, would you believe, or could you believe that it's a time when Judaism itself is being threatened? I can imagine that the people who are specifically going might imagine that they are going because Judaism and Israel are being threatened with destruction. And if that were the case, if we would conclude that Judaism is being faced with destruction, and it is a mitzvah to dwell in the land of Israel, which it is, even for a short period of time, even for an hour, it's a mitzvah to be in Israel. Is it an obligation to be in Israel is a different story. But it's a mitzvah to be in Israel, even for a few minutes. So, again, I'm not saying that I know this or concluding this for a fact, but is the mitzvah of dwelling in Israel, is it necessary to, and it's really the question I'm going to leave myself with and with you, is it necessary to put yourself at risk in order to do that mitzvah, knowing that or believing that there is a force that is threatening, or at least believes and wants to threaten, the very existence of the Jewish people, which is a stated objective of this specific enemy? So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that the concept of the mitzvah of being in Israel is a trump to the possibility of putting yourself into danger, or of the lone soldier concept, someone who believes they need to fight for the land of Israel. It's obvious that what they're feeling is that there is a threat of annihilation of Judaism and of Israel. And they're compelled to put themselves at risk in order to save Judaism. Not only to save Israelis and Jews, but to save Judaism.
How does that save Judaism?
What do you mean?
Why? Because
anytime there's a threat that Judaism or all of every Jew should be eradicated, we would feel we'd be compelled
mm-hmm.
to put ourselves at risk to stop that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is how relevant is that in a world where most Jews don't live in Israel?
It's a good question. So that's really the question. Should we go? Should we put ourselves specifically at risk in order to do that? Because maybe just being there, I don't know, maybe just being there offers a sense of chizuk, of strengthening the resolve of the soldiers who are fighting on the front line. Maybe it is. Maybe that mitzvah itself is something that we should be doing. In fact, the concept of the mitzvah of bikur cholim, of visiting sick people. You're not a doctor. But there's nonetheless a commandment under the umbrella of chesed, of being a kind person, to visit sick people. What can you do for that person? Nothing. You can do nothing. But the Talmud says you being there gives them life. And that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is you being there gives them a reason. So perhaps that's a reason. Perhaps one should put themselves into the possibility, even if it's uncertain danger. And maybe even specifically because it's been proven that it's not dangerous. Maybe a person should be even obligated, really is the question, to be there, because that in itself creates the momentum for what we are fighting for, which is the saving of our people and the land of Israel. Yes.
So if you're saying all the troops that are going into Gaza, Gaza is clearly a dangerous place right now.
Yes.
But they're going to help the Jewish people continue on staying in Israel, because if not, we're going to get attacked by rockets and ground forces and whatever.
Yes.
But they are putting themselves at risk, so the point is moot.
Well, we spoke about, before you came, we spoke about the institution of the military, where a person has to put themselves at risk
Okay.
in order to save lives.
Okay. So you are putting yourself at risk.
You are.
And it's allowed.
It is allowed. It's not only allowed, it's an obligation.
Right.
It's an obligation to put yourself in danger, it seems, if in order to not imminent danger, meaning if somebody were holding a gun over there and Steve jumped in front on purpose to stop me from killing you, he's not obligated to do that. But according to some of our commentaries, he can volunteer to do that. He could volunteer, but he's not obligated.
Not to get political, but is there a distinction between, obviously there's Medinat Yisrael, which is like the secular state, but is the current manifestation of, the Jewish people living in Israel. And that's under threat, but how does that kind of compare to the idea of like Eretz Israel, which is really like a spiritual state?
Yes.
So even though, the Israeli army, you could say, well, this is the Jewish army, protecting the Jewish people, the spiritual state of Eretz Israel, that's unchanging. So how does that kind of come into play with all of this?
Well, you're right. You're right. There is a distinction.
Right.
And the main, it seems that vis-a-vis this discussion, as I said, the stated goal of this specific enemy is to kill Jews.
Right.
And even Jews who don't live in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So, the distinction between Medinat Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael really doesn't even come into play vis-a-vis this specific enemy, because this specific enemy, the mitzvah is to defend human beings.
Yeah.
Right? On the other hand, there still is a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the concept of it being an obligation is a question, but when you're in Israel, you are fulfilling a mitzvah. Every step you take, every moment you're there on its soil, you are doing a mitzvah. So, again, just the concept of it being of the threat of not having that connection to the land might be enough reason also to put yourself at risk.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the current manifestation of the state of Israel and its military, just like any government and its military, I don't know if the majority or what portion of the IDF is fighting for Eretz Yisrael, or they're just fighting for Medinat Yisrael, or they're just fighting for democracy. I don't know what they're fighting for. I don't know what's in their minds, but halachically speaking, obviously, to fight, to defend imminent danger to civilians is a mitzvah, and even to voluntarily put yourself at risk to do such a thing there's precedent for that in Jewish law. And the only thing that it seems is, in my mind, is an interesting question is the mitzvah of being in the land itself. Should one put oneself at risk for the ability to do that mitzvah? It seems
or for the ability for others to do that mitzvah.
Or for the ability of others to do that mitzvah, right? And that it seems, there was, obviously there were, I'm sorry, I know that you're raising your hand. All throughout our history, there have been movements to try to get to Israel, even though the journey was filled with all sorts of
Obstacles.
dangerous obstacles, where one's life would be literally hanging in the balance, and that we didn't have the relationship with the nations of the world as we do, even though pretty shaky right now. A Jew traveling from Lithuania to Israel with a horse and buggy was a tragedy waiting to happen, and yet we know the stories of the caravans of people who would try to make their way to Israel, literally putting themselves at risk in order to be on the land, even with their dying breath in the land of Israel. To them was worth it. So the question is for us, when we feel, we consider that there are enemies that don't want us to exist, not only want us to exist in Israel, but exist at all. Perhaps we should feel compelled to be there in the first place, or at least make the journey there. So, and even at the potential risk, in order to be able to fulfill that mitzvah. Yeah.
The concept of risking your life to fulfill a mitzvah seems kind of at contrast with something you mentioned earlier, like actually disobeying actual law in order to not put yourself at risk.
Right.
The thing that comes to my mind, she mentioned the mitzvah of visiting the sick, but I imagine someone who has some sort of compromised immune system going to visit someone with Ebola, someone would probably say you probably shouldn't do that because that's putting yourself at extreme risk. It seems that we would probably have a less stringent. It seems like it would be under Jewish law, you'd be less compelled to do a mitzvah and put your life at risk to do it than you would some sort of actual law. And we know that under even laws are supposed to be broken if you're actually putting yourself at serious risk.
Right. So right. You are right, and that's the distinction I'm trying to make. In that for positive commandments, we generally do not put ourselves at risk. For negative commandments, we would, especially if it were to contain what we call a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God. However, that fifth exception that I explained of Judaism being at risk
I'm so sorry I missed you when you're down.
is I don't know, but does that kind of situation, what we call in Hebrew shmad, when there is a concerted effort to destroy Jews and Judaism, that we would put ourselves at risk in order to even perform a positive mitzvah. So generally speaking, you're right. We do not, as I explained in the beginning, we do not risk our lives to perform a mitzvah, and specifically even the negative commandments, we would transgress them in order to save our lives, generally speaking. But in a situation where we might conclude that there's an existential threat to both the Jewish religion and Jewish existence, maybe we would also, and maybe this specific situation. I mean, Netanyahu himself said right at the beginning of this that this was this wasn't just a war. It was a war of an existential war. That Jews and Judaism are at risk. At least that's what he felt. I'm not so sure that that's real. But again, it's something interesting to consider in relationship to how we view these general principles. I'm not going to tell anybody that they should go, but yeah.
Now, is there anything in the Torah that mentions like how one might define an actual existential threat?
I think it's one of those things where you know it when you see it. You know it when you see it. You know, I find that I'm just going to shut this off right now. But I